Welcome to iii. iii solves the traditional problem of assembling a bunch of disjointed services into your system. So traditionally, if you wanted to add cron tasks or perhaps a queue or HTTP endpoint, they all came with their own set of issues, different primitives. You had to learn, you had to configure them, and then they have to interact with them. So each additional piece that you add increases the complexity exponentially. However, that's different with iii. So with iii, you can build software, and when it's time to add an integration like that, it already reuses the same primitives that you've been using for the other services as well. So if you want to integrate streaming or observability or even an AI agent harness, they all use the same primitives. So it makes adding a new capability to your system much easier. And of course, iii is open source. You can find it on GitHub. So traditionally, if you have a backend and you want to add queues or cron and so on, they have their own integration story. But now with iii, those are actually just workers. So if you want to add a new capability in iii, you would add a worker. A worker brings functions to the system. So in the functions, you have the actual work. So the meat of the logic of a capability is still in the functions. Those functions need to be triggered somehow. This can be through an HTTP endpoint or a state change or you manually from the CLI, but there will be some kind of trigger to run the actual function. These functions and triggers can be in different languages. So it may be that your REST API capability in your system is written in TypeScript, but it may be called from a Python part of your system or even Rust. And these functions and triggers are part of a worker. So if you want to add a new capability, you add a new worker. So let's see how it actually works. So you can actually install iii here with the install button on the website. So I can run iii commands now in my terminal. I'm using the quick start template here to initialize a new project. Let's press enter here. And now I have a very basic iii project right here. So here we have a config file that allows us to specify the workers that should be part of our system. You can see here that we have an observability worker as well as a queue worker. So there are a few very common workers that are already available as built-in workers with iii. However, of course, we may want to have our own workers as well. So there are two workers here coming with this quick start. We have a worker here that actually registers a function in Python. This function is just doing some work. It may do some mathematical calculations. So here we can see an add handler function. It's going to get some input here and does some calculation. And ultimately, these functions optionally can return a result. We then register the function. So we give it a particular ID, typically in this format, and that's just registering a function. We are not invoking it or triggering it anywhere. So we have another worker here, which is actually using TypeScript that is actually going to trigger this, even though this is in Python. So if we close this and we go to the TypeScript worker here, this one is also registering a function. So it also is doing something. So the implementation of this function, we can see it's using a logger. This comes also built in with iii. It's integrated with a console, as I'll show you in a second. But this can trigger the function from another worker. So here we specify that function ID I just showed you. We can pass in the payload as well and also returns a result. That is all that is happening here. This .iii is just a configuration folder. Let's actually start the engine now. So iii has an engine. So if I run this command, it's going to run an engine based on the configuration here in the root. You can think of the engine as like the central routing part of the system. So when a function is called, it goes through the engine, looks up which worker has registered that function, and then invokes the function from the appropriate worker. Right, so workers are connected through this engine over a WebSocket. So you can just run the workers where you want them to run. Can be in a Kubernetes cluster, can be somewhere else. And the function calls are just routed through this engine, but it needs to be running. So now I have the engine running, and the output here will show you some of the functions that it has discovered. It's doing that based on the config here. And the config here is only specifying these built-in workers. It has not discovered our custom workers here. So I can run iii worker add and then the location of that worker. If I run this, we can see that now if I go back to this config file, this math worker has been added here to the config. It has automatically been picked up here by the engine as well. That was the Python worker. Now I'm going to add this TypeScript worker as well. As I'm adding these workers, it's registering the functions with the engine, and it's also installing any dependencies that it may need. You can see that the new function has been registered here. It's the math to add two numbers. We can trigger it in several ways. One of the ways is to simply do it here from the terminal. So I can run iii trigger and then the ID of the function, and I can pass a payload. Let's see what happens when I press enter. All right, so here we get a value returned, and it's showing us the total and a success message. So what happened here is that we invoked this function here in the TypeScript worker, which in turn triggers this function in the Python worker. So it got a result, and ultimately that is being displayed here in the output in the terminal. So now we're able to work in a cross-language manner very smoothly. Let's say we want to add a new capability, we want to add state to our system. Traditionally, you would have to learn something new, or you would have to learn how to integrate this into your existing system. Well, here we can just add it as a worker. There is the iii state worker, and I can add it with this command. It's going to add it to the config. So now here we can see another worker added to the config, which means now our custom worker here can interact with state. So here in the Python worker, I can use this function here, state.get, to read from the state. And a little bit later here, I can also set something new in that state. So now if we trigger that math add function again, and let's actually do it a few times, we should be able to see that it persists the state. So currently the total is 5. If I simply call it again, we can see that the running total actually jumps to 10 here. You can see it's able to keep persisting the total. So here I've been sort of manually triggering the TypeScript function, but let's say we want to create an API endpoint that is the trigger. So I can add another worker I just have to add the HTTP worker. That's another one we can add to the config here. So now you can see the HTTP worker has been added. So here there are some default settings. Then here in our TypeScript worker, we can set up a trigger. So we want to run a function when there is an actual HTTP request. This should be a post request, and we have some API path for that. And then we can specify the function we want to run when that trigger occurs. And notice here that the engine picks up on this as I'm saving the file. You can see that it has picked up here on this new endpoint. So let's actually try invoking it. I'm going to send a curl request here to that API path that we set up and the port one in the config with some body data. Let's actually see what we get. All right, so here we get a response with the running total. If I simply call it again, you can see that the running total increases because it's reading from state as well. So what we just did is start the iii engine. This needs to be running, and this is connected with these workers over WebSocket. So we have a custom worker here, our math worker, which contributes a function in Python. Then we had another one in TypeScript also contributing a function. And we have that iii state worker, and there was another one for HTTP. So then we triggered a function from the CLI, but can be from other places, of course. The point is that it will go through the iii engine, which is going to look up which worker is contributing that function, and then invokes it from the right worker. That is the architecture in a nutshell. You do not have to create a bunch of workers yourself. As we saw, some of them already exist. You can use them right now. There is a registry of these workers here, very similar to how the NPM module system works, which you can find on the website actually. iii comes with some very common ones like the HTTP that we saw, but also cron tasks or pub/sub or queue. And there's actually an overview here of the most popular ones as well. So when you want to add a new capability, you may want to check this first so you're not necessarily creating a whole worker from scratch yourself. It may already exist. A very common pain point is also getting observability into your system. This is very easy with iii. I just have to run the console here. It will give us an address, and I can open it up actually inside my IDE if I want, or just in the browser, but it will show you the functions that have been registered here with the engine, including their triggers. So for example, here I have the HTTP trigger. I can even call it right here from the dashboard. I do not have to send curl requests in the terminal. You can do a lot of this here in the UI. We get an overview of the states as well. So we were keeping track of adding those numbers. There's also streaming here and queues and of course traces. So we have detailed insights into what exactly is happening in our system. You can also read the logs here. So by using iii, you can add a lot of advanced capabilities to your system very easily. And these are not only the traditional state or queues or cron tasks, but also AI agents. If you're building some kind of harness, you may think that you need a separate system or runtime for this agent harness, which you then have to awkwardly try to integrate with the rest of your system. This is not necessary. In iii, it can just be a worker like the other workers in your system. It uses the same primitives. The tools of the agent can be the functions. You can use the state for memory, right? It can just use a trigger to start running, and you get that observability out of the box with tracing and logs. And it's a live system. So as you're adding a new worker, those functions and triggers that it contributes become visible across the system in real time. So you could even allow your AI agent to add new capabilities in a live manner and really create this agentic system with the same primitives that you use for the rest of your backend. That is iii in a nutshell. I would say come try it out. I recommend you start with the quick start that you can find here on the website.